I am going to go ahead and start because we've got a lot of content to get through, and we will record this for everyone that is late. And Lisa and Danny or Melissa rather, Danny, Melissa will go ahead and all right, people are still coming in via lobby. All right, if everyone can see my screen, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we will let people join as they see fit. So my name is Molly Yanis, and I'm the founder of Echo Consulting Project Management Solutions. We really focus in project management, short-term, part-time, staff augmentation, software implementations. We have a lot of traction right now with baby PMO implementations, which I'm loving, strategic planning, prioritization, and all that other good stuff. For today's webinar, definitely don't hesitate to interrupt with a question. You are also welcome to use the chat to put in a question, and I've got team members on board that will, interrupt me with questions as well. Be aware that we will send a copy of this a recording of this webinar out, and we'll also send a copy of the slides to anyone that attended. So you can take notes, you can take screenshots, but be aware that we will send this out. We will also send out a survey, which we really appreciate. We do a lot of these free webinars. So if you have feedback, ideas for future topics and things like that, we'd love to have you fill out our survey and give us some feedback on kind of what's next. Today, you are here to talk about risk management, and I'm going to dive right in. So when we talk about risk management, we're talking about the practice of identifying, evaluating, preventing, or mitigating risks that impact. And today, we're specifically talking about risk management under the framework of project management. So risks that may impact the outcome of a project. So the first couple slides are just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language, and then we're going to be actually digging in. Our real goal today is to get into specific tools, specific techniques, and tactics to utilize for risk management. Okay, so when we talk about a risk, we're talking about an event that may happen, something that could happen, and it could impact the project success. When we're talking about an issue, it's something that has occurred or is currently occurring, and that it could have an impact or is going to have an impact on the project. Okay, so risk versus issue. So when we talk about project risks, we're talking about a wide variety of the risks. So in most cases in project manager, kind of traditional, right? I'm thinking scope, schedule, budget. So budget and schedule are probably some of the most common examples, but there's other types of risk too. So we can talk about performance, like is the project actually going to get the return on investment that we thought it would when we undertook this project? Is the market going to change? Is our competitive landscape going to change significantly during the project that's going to maybe impact whether or not this project should go forward? There might be operational risks. So no offense to project management, but maybe the project management isn't so hot. Maybe the efficiency of some of the internal processes and being able to access the right people is not really great. So there's definitely operational type risks. There's governance risks. And when we talk about governance risks, we can talk about oftentimes we're talking about like executive leadership and people like that are, are they really approving something, authorizing something correctly? Or strategic risks, maybe the strategy of the company changes or alters, and that impacts whether or not the project is going to either have the result that's expected and or make sense or needs to get changed. There's also legal risks as an example. One other risk that I didn't fit in here, and it's pretty much because it was an 8 and I like things that are symmetrical, but we're talking about legal risks, not legal risk, we're talking about kind of safety or just kind of external factor risk. So I mean, in Vermont, I'm in Vermont right now, and, flooding risks or a natural disaster risk is a good example of that. So these are some types of project risks, and we'll be digging into some of these when we talk about examples of mitigating risks and things a little bit later. Does anyone else have an idea or, something that they think is a type of project risk that's not captured here that they want to share? All right. One piece that I just want to mention quickly, this is kind of that PMI thought, but a risk can actually be positive or negative. Usually when we're talking about risks and we're talking about risk mitigation, we're usually focused on negative risks. So things that are going to have a negative impact on a project, but there's actually things that are positive risks as well. So it's something, again, that's like outside of the realm, but it could have a positive impact on the project success. So for example, maybe a new stakeholder came in and is really pumped and really excited about championing this project and then got all these additional resources or some other thing like that. So there are things that are positive risks that, again, impact the project success. Usually we're focusing on negative risks. A majority from today we'll be talking about negative risks. So that was kind of my high level. Make sure we're all on the same page. We're going to dig in now to the project management process, and we're going to actually go into each step of the process and talk about specific tools and techniques and tactics for those steps. So the first one, identify. So we need to make sure that we're identifying the risks. When are we identifying the risks? How are we identifying them? How often? What's the cadence of that? We need to make sure that we're assigning ownership to the risks. So who is owning which risk and what are they doing with it and what's the status of it from a mitigation strategy, analyzing the risk, understanding what the impact of the risk is and whether that changes over the course of the project. So there's things called residual risks, for example, that, you know, they come and go at different levels throughout the project. Prioritizing risks, making sure we're focusing on the highest impact, highest priority risks, responding to risks, communicating about risks, monitoring the risks again as they move forward. So this is the high level process, and now we're going to start digging in. So for risk management tools, I want to just start with like the most basics, well-known ones, right? So the risk register, capturing the risks, monitoring over the lifestyle. You know, mostly it's, you know, the goal is to have the risk identified and to be able to act on it before it happens, becomes an issue, or avoid it being an issue at all. And then oftentimes people use a issue log. So they keep risks in one place and they keep issues in another place. At Echo, we actually try to put everything all together because we find that over the life cycle of a project, a risk can become an issue can get demoted to a risk, issue can be made into a decision. And so we actually use a RAID log. And we track not just risks, but also action items, issues, decisions. And then more recently with our clients, we've had great adoption with what we call now a CRAID log. So for organizations that don't have well built out change management processes, and we're kind of starting with them from, you know, a management process maybe a little bit less mature, we actually track actions, risks, issues, decisions, and changes. And I'm just going to show you really quickly in Smart. We use one of the tools we use is Smartsheet, but we built this out in Monday. We've built this out in ClickUp and other places. It can be in Excel. You don't need to use a special project management tool for this. But the idea is that you have kind of that CRAID type. So I could list something down as a risk. And I can assign it to someone and have a due date and what the status of the risk is. I can talk about the mitigation steps, but maybe that risk unfortunately happens and it gets escalated to being an issue, or maybe that risk, you know, requires a decision and I need to create another row for that. So we use something that we call a CRAID log for our day-to-day management. For risk identification, just a couple of quick techniques. So some of the more common ones for risk identification is kind of reviewing the documents, whether it's reviewing the requirements, reviewing the work breakdown structure, and looking at where you think there are potentially gaps that might be articulated as risks. Interviewing stakeholders, thinking about project, even team members that maybe have done similar projects or similar types and interviewing them. But then also surveys. At Echo, we really like to use a lot of anonymous opportunities for people to raise risks where they may not feel comfortable in a larger group, but they want to share kind of their personal experience or concerns about specific risks that might happen in the project. We like to do some team brainstorming activities. So we'll talk about a specific pre-mortem exercise that we do a lot with our clients, but the idea would be, you know, really spending some dedicated time to brainstorm different risks, things that might happen. And again, trying to not do that just at the beginning of the project, but figuring out a cadence throughout the project. So whether you do have stand-ups or you have specific project meetings, making space and definitely having safety for the team to be able to raise risks consistently and being able to track those proactively. So another thing that we often do is we actually start with a common risk list. So whether that came from kind of our historical experience with other projects, or maybe an organization has a list of risks, honestly, just Googling common risks, we're going to talk about some of them. You're all going to be like, yeah, absolutely. And if you start with some risks and just kind of start from that, and then that can kind of branch out and become more detailed and then really dig into the mitigation strategies. A good place to find risks is in lessons learned. So if you do capture lessons learned for previous projects, that's a great place to identify risks and address them. And then a pre-mortem exercise is another thing that we do. We'll talk a little bit about what we do at ECHO for that. So common risk categories. So this is like a place to start from and say, okay, there's a risk of poor communication, right? Now that's not quite deep enough, in my opinion, for a risk. So I would say for poor communication, like project team members, don't know the status of what's going on, or you can kind of start from poor communication and then brainstorm as a team, like all the different risks that might happen to do with communication. Unclear roles and responsibilities, lack of executive support. So you're starting a project, but you don't have executive support. And so you kind of get off track. You can't mobilize your team, whatever that looks like. Conflicting requirements. I know that no one on this call has ever found out that there's a missing requirement late in the game, but that's a risk that we should address. Missing stakeholders, not having all the perspectives there, unfeasible schedule. These are really high level categories of risks that might occur. But by starting from a point of suggesting these risks, sometimes it can spur ideas of your team to be like, oh yeah, this happened here. And it might also help spur some creative juices of what we should do to mitigate that risk. What has worked in the past? What hasn't worked in the past? No change management. We've got a couple of clients right now that are having a lot of fun with, big rollouts that didn't really have change management. If you've never been on a workshop with me before, one of my favorite quotes is I say, project management is preparing and I took this from someone else, this is not my quote, but project management is preparing the solution for the organization, and change management is preparing the organization for the solution. So as a project manager hat, I've spent all this time getting this project ready, I launch it, and then training hasn't happened and no one in the organization has bought in, and my team spent all this time and effort putting this together and the change management didn't happen. Now, of course, that would never happen on one of my projects, but yeah, change management is a major risk that we want to make sure we're aware of, and resistance to change is definitely something. So poor project management, right? Integration, tech architecture, maybe we're dependent on some technology and we didn't capture that early enough. These are some good places to kind of start with getting your team thinking about the different risks. One of the exercises that I absolutely love when you think about risk identification, and I like doing this not just at the beginning, but it's most typically at the beginning of a project, is instead of just saying like, here's the project plan, here's the work breakdown structure, here's what we've like put together, does anyone have any issues with it, right? You're basically trying to put people on the spot to say, are you the naysayer that doesn't agree with all this work we've done? Instead, turning it around and saying, I want everyone on this team to tell me why this is not going to work. Why is this project not going to work? Why is this project going to fail? Why is this going to be a total and complete mess? So instead of asking people to like bring up something that they think might be a risk and kind of putting them in a spot of being negative, instead turn everyone around being like, let's attack this. Let's tell us all the reasons why this isn't going to work. And then usually I try to do that in a blind round, right? So if you have everyone together and you can do stickies, great. There are virtual options. Our team uses Miro and Mural, but mostly Miro right now, where you say, okay, everyone brain dump all the reasons you think it's going to fail. And then you're kind of grouping them together and seeing that, wow, you know, over 50% of the project team really thinks this is going to be an issue, right? We need to spend more time on that. We only logged that as like a low risk, low impact, but most of the team thought that that would be a risk. The other thing is kind of looking for outliers. So like when I'm starting to kind of gather information about potential risks, like why does this one person, the only one that thinks this is going to happen, right? Do I just kind of ignore it because only one person is thinking that? Or do they have information that no one else on the team has and we need to dig into it? Or maybe they don't have information that everyone else on the team has and we need to address that so that they're bought in and they can actually contribute to the team, right? So pre-mortem, as a project manager, as a leader, as a project team member, constantly going back to what are the risks, what are the potential things that could throw us off track. Change is going to happen over the course of a project. It just is. So we can either be prepared and proactive, or we can just ignore it and constantly be reactive and chasing our tail. So I am very pro risk management as kind of a primary focus as a project manager and as a project team member. Like, what are the risks? What are the things that might change? How can we be prepared for them? Risk identification, one other thing, you know, making sure that we understand the root cause of the risk. So sometimes I see risk registers or risk lists that are a little bit too superficial, and maybe they're just thinking about the impact, but really like, why is that risk a risk? Why might that risk occur? This will definitely help us as we start thinking about mitigation planning, but like, the 5 whys approach, keeping on asking why it's a risk, why it's a risk, why it's a risk. Maybe you need to break it up into multiple different risks because it's too high level and you won't be able to actually do good mitigation planning if it's not detailed enough, right? So the 5 whys approach, assigning ownership. Quick quote here when we talk about accountability. So individuals and teams that have a sense of ownership, they're focused and disciplined and collaborative, and they hold each other accountable for the outcomes, right? So when we say a risk, one of the biggest issues I see with the risk logs and things like that are people have listed risks and they have mitigations and there's no name next to it. Or there's a whole team next to it, or there's 20 people. Every risk should have an owner. They should have a risk owner, and everyone on the team should know what it means to be an owner, right? And that can be really hard in the culture of organizations to put your name next to a risk. And so as a project manager, as a team member, how do you create the safety for people to own risks, understanding that some of those risks are going to become issues and that person, you know, it might not be the fault of that person or even that team, but like they are going to have to own it. So again, one of the most important things when you list out the risks for your project, or honestly, the risks for anything in your life, is to actually put an owner next to it. And that owner should be a single person, not a team of people, not 5 people. It needs to be one person that owns each risk. Anyone want to push back on me on that? Or you're just going to let me keep going and ask questions at the end? So there's a couple of different tools we use at Echo when we talk about accountability, and we don't just use this for risk planning and risk ownership. We use this for project roles in general and just honestly even operational roles. So the first one, and probably one of the most popular, actually usually it's called RACI, R-A-C-I. We use RASCI because I like to separate out supporting versus consulted. So who's responsible for getting the work done, who's accountable. This is the person that typically reports up to like a leadership team or executive leadership or senior leadership. Who's supporting. So this person might be a hands on the keyboard person, but there's a single person responsible for the risk. There's a single person responsible for a task or activity. Who is consulted? So this is a person that's not specifically assigned, but might be consulted because maybe they've done it before. Maybe they have experience with a project of this type. So even though they're not on the project, they're not on the team, that person can be consulted about what they did to solve the last issue that came up. Or someone that just needs to get informed. So who needs to know about those risks on that project, and what risks do they need to know about? So RASCI, one of my favorites. Another one that's pretty popular is PASKI. So who's performing? So very similar to responsible, right? Like who's performing the work, who's accountable, who's controlling. And when we say control, what you're really thinking is like who has to review this or approve the work, right? So like who can approve it, reject it, and then also suggesting, again, I use that typically as like consulting, but like they don't necessarily have the authority, but their advice is very useful to the person that's performing the work. And then again, who needs to be informed. So PASKI is another tool that people use. And then PACE. This one less so for risk management, but I always like to call these up. These are different tools that you can use if you are struggling with accountability in your project team or in your organization and understanding who is accountable, who owns a given task or activity. So the process owner or the leader, the approver, again, someone that's reviewing, approving, has the ability to reject, has the authority to reject it and make you start from scratch or make you start over again. A contributor, someone, again, hands on the keyboard, you want their opinion, but they don't necessarily get to decide. They're not a decision maker, as it were. And then executors, people that are actually going to be, again, I call it hands on the keyboard to complete. Okay, so those are 3 common tools when you start talking about accountability and really driving ownership in your organization. All right, so now we're going to get into a little bit deeper and we're going to be talking about analyzing the risk. So one of the things that we like to push is team sourced risk management, so not just individuals. So what are the risks that the team feels as a whole is important? Like how do we go into the project with like eyes wide open? So we're going to talk about some different risk types in a moment again, but I think we already mentioned this. Outliers are interesting. Articulating the assumptions. Assumptions definitely can also show up on the risk register. Like I'm assuming this. If my assumption is wrong, that's a risk, right? So sometimes people aren't comfortable talking about it in terms of this is a risk or not, but they are typical saying like, oh, you're assuming this or you know this, right? And then towards that end, assigning a confidence ratio. So another thing I work with, especially when I'm working on technical projects or with developers and things like that, maybe they're uncomfortable giving me an estimate because they don't have enough information yet, right? So what I try to do is kind of couch my request or couch my information with a confidence ratio, like how, and again, we'll talk about this in terms of measuring like probability and other things like that, but it's like, how likely is this to happen? Are we talking like 50% or 80% or 20%? Like giving them kind of breaking it down in terms of how confident they are that this is a risk for this project, right? It's just kind of another way to kind of take another pass and prioritize and things like that. So team sourced, how do you get the team to come together with the goal of risk identification, but then also analyzing the risk, making sure we understand the depth of the risk and the impact. We'll just talk about that in a second. So understanding the impact, what's the impact, scope, schedule, budget, who is impacted, and this is really important. So one of the pieces that I like to talk about with my team is complexity of the risk. And one of the ways to talk about the complexity of the risk is obviously the impact in terms of how many different tasks or dependencies, for example, are impacted by this one risk. But the other thing is the complexity of the number of people or the number of teams that are impacted, the number of people that will have to be informed, the number of people that will have to be involved in that mitigation strategy. So understanding the complexity of the risk in addition to the impact and the likelihood of it happening. Okay, so risk analysis tools, probably the most common one is impact versus probability, right? So like how big of an impact is this going to have, high, medium, low, and how likely is this to happen? Like very likely, unlikely, you know, we're not sure. And then you can overlay the concept of a confidence ratio. How confident are you of the impact of this, right? So like think about, I didn't have this in my slide deck, but think about the bell curve as it were, right? Like I believe that most likely the impact is, you know, medium, but in extreme cases, it could be extremely high. So like, what are we, you know, what's the average impact as it were? Okay. And then probability, same thing. Probability can actually change over the course of the project. So if we think about those risk categories we talked about early on, and like one of the risk categories is missing requirements, right? The probability of missing requirements when you are doing requirements gathering is pretty high, but the impact is pretty low. But a missing requirement that is discovered during UAT is less probable, but the impact is much higher. So this is also just not a point in time. This is something that happens and ebbs and flows over the course of the entire project. Similarly, when you think about the risk of a missing requirement, and again, I recommend a more detailed risk than just missing requirements, but it's a good example. Think about who owns that at different points in the project, because the person that owns a missing requirement at one point in the process might be different. So I'm not going to go too deep into this, but the idea is that the probability changes over time, the impact changes over time, as well as the ownership of a given risk might change over time. I'm going fast. Did anyone want to jump in and give an example or ask any questions at this point? I'm going to look at chat really quick just to make sure. All right, no one's asked any questions yet, so I'm going to keep going. And so another way to think about it is the different types of impacts. And we talked a little bit about this earlier when we were talking about types of risks. I'm actually using the exact same list as type of risks, but types of impacts. So impact of a risk, right? Oftentimes is a budget, schedule, performance, like will the project be successful? Are we going to hit the return on investment that we promised when we got the budget? The impact to the market, like from the project, the impact to operations, if the risk happens, and then impact to the governance, to strategic, and to legal, right? So these are types of risks, but these are also types of impacts that a risk could have. All righty. So we're going to talk about prioritization, and we're going to talk a little bit about the mathematics behind this, but when we talk about prioritization, probably the most common one, I think it's called the Eisenhower method. So urgency versus severity of impact or importance, as it were, right? So like, how is this super urgent as in it needs to, it's going to happen in the next day or two, or is this something that's going to happen in the next 3 months, in which case mitigation planning might be able to wait until our next session, versus the severity of the impact, and then obviously focusing on the ones that are most urgent and most severe impact first. So when we go into risk mitigation planning, we want to be focusing on the most important risks first for us to deeper dive into that mitigation planning. So when we think about prioritization, using the Eisenhower method, urgency versus importance. When we think about risk prioritization, I think, again, probably the most popular method for this is a risk score. And the most simple, straightforward method is like the impact that a risk would likely have versus the probability of the risk happening, and then multiplying that. And you can use 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 3, really it depends on the organization and how granular you want to be able to get into this. It's really important when you do an activity like this, you think about how the activity is going to work out. Are you having individuals score this? Are you trying to do this as a team? What if someone disagrees with the impact? How are you defining the impact of 1 through 5? How are you defining probability? Sometimes you want to do ranges, like an impact is less than a 5% change on scope, schedule, or budget, or something like that. Probability means less than 20%. So instead of just using numbers, you're actually putting ranges to those numbers. And then basically you're just multiplying. So here's a given risk, here's the impact, here's the probability. So the impact is extremely high, but the probability is low. So the score is only a 5. Impact for probability for very likely to happen. Okay, 16. If we're looking at this and I'm prioritizing my risks, I want to focus on what risk first? I want to focus on risk 3. Any questions? That's kind of like the most basic risk scoring mechanism. You can make this way more complex. And I just gave a couple of examples, but you can think about probability. One of the things that you can do is instead of just saying probability 1 through 5 is you can actually put words to it. And sometimes that's a little bit more digestible and less intimidating for your team. So you can say probability is very high, high, medium, low, very low. And then after the fact, take that information and translate it into numbers. What's nice about this too is that you can kind of from there kind of weight things. So I could say a very high probability is a 10, a high is a 7, a medium is a 4, a low is a 2, and a very low is a 1. So instead of doing it exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I can actually kind of weight it a little bit by using different numbers. And I often do that by giving people words and then kind of mapping each word to a different calculation. You don't just have to do probability versus impact. You can actually have multiple different factors that maybe are important to you. So I often talk about this in terms of company values. And a good example is like a construction company or something like that. So if there's a safety concern and your value is like safety on every job and like no accidents. So one of my clients one time, like they tracked 0 accidents and how many days for 0 accidents. So they weighted safety extremely high. And they used it as their, as their piece. For others, like in a tech project, safety, probably not one of the criteria that I'm ranking risks against. I'm a consultant and I have a consulting firm. So client satisfaction is something that we call out separately versus, schedule and scope, because some clients, right, are really, really, really focused just on this, on the budget. And other clients are really, really, really focused just on the schedule, right? So I can kind of have a different ranking that I use to think about client satisfaction. How likely is this risk to impact whether the client is happy with the end goal? And that's a little bit different than scope, schedule, and budget. So you can have whatever criteria you want. You can do whatever levels you want. You don't have to do numbers, but the idea is still the same, that you're multiplying these out and that you're having some sort of numerical way, quantitative way to identify which risks are the highest priority. Why do you care which risks are the highest priority? The highest priority risks deserve the most attention for mitigation planning, right? They deserve the most attention from a communication standpoint, and people should be aware of them because they're high priority risks. It's not just the ones that are most probable of happening. It's the ones that have the greatest, potential, impact on whatever that ratio is that you use. So you can create your own columns and your own number. I've seen some really complex calculations here, and you can even kind of change them and add kind of a different filter on them, but risk rating calculations is one way to prioritize. So up until this point, we've been talking about identifying risks, and we've been talking about, their impact and prioritizing which risks to spend a majority of your time on. Now we're actually going to talk about, well, what are we doing to respond to the risk, right? And I usually just think about this as risk mitigation, but in this risk process that we showed you guys, it's called respond, mitigation planning. So for risk mitigation, there's 4 common types of mitigation. We can avoid the risk altogether. We can mitigate the risk. We can transfer the risk, or we can accept the risk. And I like this little visual to talk through this. So, and I did get this from pmtraining.net, so that's my source. So in this case, they're doing a picture of your project is jumping off the cliff. I added this little parachute here because I think the project is to, create a way to get down the cliff safely. But anyways, your project. So avoid the risk. Don't jump off the cliff, right? Like, don't do it. Maybe you walk around. Maybe you find another path. Maybe you determine that jumping off the risk just doesn't make any sense. So we're not going to do this. We're going to avoid this risk. And sometimes that means avoid the project. And sometimes this means, change the scope. We are completely eliminating this risk. We are getting rid of it. That's avoiding it. We're not doing it. Okay. Mitigating it in this view is they're adding a trampoline, I believe, or they're adding some sort of safety precaution down there to mitigate the risk of jumping off the cliff. Okay. this person is paying someone to jump off the cliff for them because I guess the requirements were just to have someone jump off the cliff. It didn't matter that it's you or not. So they're transferring the risk. When we talk about transferring the risk, we're pretty much thinking about like insurance, right? When we're talking about budgets and things like that, we're buying insurance, we're transferring it to a different team. It's not disappearing, it still could happen, but we're transferring it to someone else to get it to a point where we're comfortable enough with it. Or we can accept the risk and say, you know what, I'm just going to jump and hopefully it'll all be good. Now, accepting the risk is a valid, we're going to talk more about it. Like it's a totally valid approach in some cases. Like I jump off a cliff that was 4 feet, but I might not jump off a cliff that's 40 feet. So we got to think about what we're actually saying when we're accepting this risk and what risks are accepted. The other piece is who gets to make that decision. So if I'm on my own time, and I'm just walking along and I want to jump off a rock that's 4 feet, like that's one thing. But if I'm on someone else's time or I'm working and I'm under their insurance, like maybe they're not comfortable with me jumping it off because if I break my ankle, it's workers' comp or something like that. So when we accept risks, it's especially important that we are aware of who is that accountable party, who is the approver, and who has the right to decide if that risk is acceptable or not. Almost never is the person that can approve that a project manager. And if the project manager thinks they're able to, you want to make sure that that's pretty well documented and understood in your culture, that the project manager can just be like, oh, let's just accept this risk and not worry about it, right? So anyways, just a side note there. Any questions about the different kind of ways of mitigating? We're gonna dig into this a little bit deeper. All righty. Risk mitigation tools. This is interestingly enough, not used as much as it should be. A contingency plan. So, so when you have a plan, a mitigation step, like you've said, how am I going to mitigate this risk, right? I'm going to avoid the risk altogether. I'm going to mitigate the risk. I'm going to come up with some idea. I'm going to work with my team to come up with this really awesome plan of how to mitigate this risk so that if it happens, it's not that bad, right? Versus transferring it, we're going to pay for insurance, we're going to use a vendor, we're going to do something like this versus accepting it, right? I have to think about what my strategy is first, and maybe I could use multiple strategies with the same risk, right? And I can kind of just pick which one makes sense if it actually occurs, because again, throughout the project, it's different. Then I'm going to think about a contingency plan, right? So building a huge trampoline underneath the cliff might be expensive. It might take some extra money or time or effort, right, to create a trampoline that may or may not be needed. So contingency, I oftentimes think about it as, scope, schedule, well, really just budget and schedule. So a couple different ways to use contingency as a project manager or as a risk manager, right? So like a contingency could be a bucket of money. So it could be 10% of the project budget or 10% of the project phase or whatever that looked like, a portion of money that I might have that I'm having for a rainy day, as it were, if one of these risks occurs and I need to jump on it. Contingency can be schedule, extra time you've built in, so into your schedule. Contingency in a less direct way can be social capital that you use, like internally with your team or with a client, like areas that you maybe have given yourself some extra time because maybe you're going to need that if something goes, goes sideways and everything. So it can be social capital, and it could be a relationship that you make a point of having during a project because that's a key stakeholder and they're really, a really in-demand resource. So how do you have that? So anyways, contingency plan, what's my backup plan? As a project manager, just as a person in general, I love planning. So I like to have plan A, plan B, plan C, and obviously you have to have plan A, A1, A2, etc. But contingency plans can mean different things to different people. I would say having a contingency plan as a project manager is like, again, I think Neil said it really well. It's like, it's often overlooked, right? Like, contingency is not just scopes and not just schedule and budget. It really is kind of the way that you approach it, the way that you have relationships in the project. So contingency plan. And then the other piece this is just like, it's a classic, right? So you have risks, you've identified the risks, you've prioritized the risks. Great, I have a list of risks and the risks are there. Look at them, they're beautiful. What's the point of going through all the effort just to like put a pretty list of risks that might happen on there, right? Like you just spent all that time just to make a list or a task list of these are risks? No, like you have to actually dedicate time to mitigation strategies. And it's not just a matter of, ooh, I have a risk, immediately come up with a mitigation strategy. I don't know if you have all of that in the middle of your head, but if you've already solved the issue, then, or you already know what the solution is, like it's, what I would say is like two different exercises, right? Like here's a risk. What is our approach for mitigating the risk? And then what are the different mitigation strategies with that approach, right? Maybe you want to put a big trampoline at the bottom. Maybe you want to have one of those big umbrellas where you have people that just stand at the bottom holding the umbrella for days on end in case the person that's on the top of the cliff might fall, right? Those are both strategies, right? But like, which one makes the most sense in that scenario? Maybe you want to have everyone on your team wear a parachute all the time in case they might get to a cliff. But maybe the cliff's only 4 feet. That parachute's not going to help. So the mitigation planning time is really important. And as a project manager, I think that it needs to have dedicated time separate than just coming up with risks and project status and everything like that. So we call it the war room approach, but like put really smart people, your project team, in a room with a prioritized list of risks, and they focus on creative strategies for those risks, right? Like they think about all the different ways they could solve that. And that's part of being proactive. So often as a project manager, as a risk manager, right? Like I'm constantly fighting fires. I'm constantly focusing on issues, right? But actually putting the time in to think about, here are all the things that could go wrong. What are the ways we could fix them? What are the ways we could mitigate this? How could we avoid this, right? So dedicated time, I call it war room approach. You can call it whatever you want, but dedicated time with really smart people on your project team to focus on mitigating the risks. Monitoring risks, important. So this is just, you know, a quick kind of overview communication planning. So you need to involve people in conversations about risks. You need to invite them to give you risks, right? So if you've ever been in a meeting with me, especially in project meetings, I end almost every single meeting with like, all right, what were the risks? What are the risks? What are the issues? You know, what are the decisions we made, right? So one of the things that we're pushing really hard with our clients right now, call me crazy, this isn't the purpose of the meeting, but like get rid of meeting notes. Like get rid of meeting notes and move to a RAID log. Because what's the point of a meeting, right? I want to know what the risks are, what the issues are, what decisions are being made or that haven't been made that need to be made, and what are the action items. That's what I want to know. I just don't want some notes about, oh, we talked about this and we talked about, no, what are the risks? What are the issues? What are the decisions? What are the action items? So that was probably a little bit too far out. We'll have a different session on CRADES, but we need to open conversations. We need to set the expectation with a team that their role is to identify risks. Their role is to tell you why things are going to go wrong. That is their role. It's not just executing on tasks. It is to provide feedback on risks. As a project manager, you are collecting that. You need to be open to the feedback from your team, and a risk should not be shut down, right? It's like, no, I just need you to do this. No. Risks are very important. You need to be open to that. There needs to be safety. So inviting to the steering committee role, understanding, like involving people in the conversation, consulting people. So this is where we talk about surveys, requests for input, Q&A sessions are a good example as well, especially early on when you're doing change management and training and things like that, like asking people for risks, doing focus groups, like focused on that, partnering. So inviting partners into the steering committee, have champions, subject matter experts that are really partnering with you risks, getting them involved, and then informing. So great, you have a risk register, you came up with these amazing mitigation strategies in this dedicated time, in this war room you did with your team. Great. Well, are you the only person that looks at your risk register? How many times have you brought that up with your project team? How many times in the organization has anyone seen your risk register? If it's only you and no one's seen it in the last month, not a terribly effective communication method. So how do we announce this? How do we provide the content? How are we, how are we saying whether this risk has been updated recently? So how are you informing people about these risks? Communication plan, risks needs to be part of your communication planning. So are risks being brought up in stand-up? Are there stakeholder updates? The board meeting, is there time for board members to bring up risks? And then again, that postmortem, understanding those risks and being able to help teams as they move forward. So again, this is more general communication planning, but definitely used in terms of risks. Okay. So we are ahead of schedule. I talk really fast and I like having questions. So risk management, what did we talk to about today? How do we identify risks? How do we assign ownership to risks? How do we analyze risks, prioritize, respond, and monitor? And these are the tools that we talked about, and these are some of our favorites that I want you to be able to go forth and use with your teams. So using a pre-mortem, spending some time thinking about all the reasons that this is going to go wrong, put everyone's mind to it. Common risk list. If your team feels unsafe, if they don't feel like they can really put out their idea of risks, you put the idea out of risks, send out all the different risks, and then have them give you details. If you're having trouble with accountability, I gave you a couple of tools for that. It's a cultural thing. It's really important. So these might not work for you, but how do you start thinking about roles versus individuals, and what roles have those responsibilities? And then for when you're analyzing risk, why? Okay. Impact versus probability, the most common risk rating, pretty simple. If you don't have anything from a risk rating standpoint, this is where you start. Team sourcing your risks, it shouldn't just be individuals. Prioritizing, risk score, risk rating, responding, contingency planning, my favorite, like what is your different contingency? It's not just having a budget contingency, that's not the only one. There's different types of contingency. War room approach, make sure that your team has time to actually think about mitigation plans. It's not, oh, we have a risk, we immediately put notes in mitigation. Sure, if you've already solved a risk, great, but in most cases, that's not the case. You have to think about it. You have to be creative about what actually makes sense for mitigation. Just having something on the mitigation line is not enough, right? I would even challenge yourself if you're starting out to say, I want 3 different mitigations for this risk. 3 different ways that we could mitigate this risk. And then as a team, choose what mitigation strategy makes the most sense for that risk. If you challenge them to give you more than one, it can get you, moving in a way that actually could be used. So many times I see someone like listed out the risk, it becomes an issue, and then the mitigation is nothing like what they actually do, right? So actually start making mitigation planning actually work for you. Monitor, RAID log. I highly recommend you combine your risks and issue logs and just filter them down based on risks versus issues, because unfortunately risks become issues. And sometimes if you're lucky, issues become risks, right? So anyways, and then communication planning, make sure that risks are involved in your communication, not just task status, not just health status, make risks part of your process. Any questions? So I went really fast, really quick, and then I'll open it up for questions if anyone's willing to share any questions or ideas. So we have another webinar coming up next month on how to select a project management system. We have how to implement a project management system. We're going to be doing a webinar on Smartsheet for small businesses. We're a Smartsheet partner. We have a lot of traction with Smartsheet right now. And then we're going to be talking about improving strategic alignment with project intake and prioritization. If you like this webinar and you like any of these other topics, please register. We have a YouTube channel where almost all of our webinars are posted. So if you haven't seen our previous webinars and want to check it out, we'll send out the YouTube link, and feel free to check out our other content. And if you could subscribe, that would make me really happy, because subscription helps us get the word out. Is there anything else? No, I think that's it. So does anyone have any questions, any specific examples they want to call out, or any ideas that we didn't share that you have found to be really effective for risk management on your team?
I think you already spoke to it somewhat. Hey guys, this is Neil. How are you?
Hey Neil, thanks for jumping in.
Yeah, so I just posted in the chat there, we have, my current organization, one thing that we implemented with me joining the team here at MedPro Group was having a RAID board. You know, we have a RAID board in our project management tool. We use Jira, but could work anywhere. And you know, we have a scrum of scrums, usually 3 days a week, and the PMO group goes over the raids, and we certainly back each other up by you know, just the shared experience. We might be on different projects, might be within different verticals within the org, but you know, having that SOS and then reviewing the raids together really helps. And lots of times other risks and other codependencies will show up as we're talking through them, right, that we weren't aware of. So it adds more flavor and reduce the overall risk by us coming together as a team on these. So just some.
I love that, Neil. I've just got a quick question on that. So when you say RAID board, are your columns like, are your columns the different types of raids? Like,
so really, yeah. So really, what it is it's kind of like a developer's approach, maybe. Like we have a Kanban board, so we have a separate project set up, and it's raids, you know.
Risks, issues, actions. So what are the phases they go through?
Yeah. So we just work it. So the raid will just have the details of what's in there. So it's not the matrix like you were sharing. It's just like each raid is a separate risk, is a separate item, is a separate issue. Like you were saying, you know, risk and issues can be the same thing. So in this case, that's supporting of that paradigm. Like it's they're all in the same bucket. And then it's just, you know, basically it's a Kanban board. So you're just moving through rating to working, and done. But this way it gets, you know, maximum exposure to the whole organization. Anybody can get tagged on it. And there's, like you said, there's one owner, which is paramount, right?
Yes.
One owner for each issue. And sometimes they get bifurcated or they have subtasks or whatever. But, you know, it's like, again, it's paramount that it's visible and that it has an owner.
Yeah. So I was just trying to understand, like, if your columns were like actions, change requests, decisions, risks, or like they were by project, or like how it was. I'm just curious. I love that. Sometimes we do it by like assigned to, for example, too. So when you say the single owner, like it's the owner, or you could even do it by priority for the different risks and things like that. But just curious. I love the idea.
Yeah, we didn't ever broke it down with those, like those kind of details would just be in the ticket, but that's a good point. That's maybe a better, to bring better clarity to it. We could have those in buckets, so we could have them on a dashboard and you could see what the area the raids are in. Right now, we just have them separated out by like, this is like executive level, this is MO level, this is, et cetera.
Yeah. No, I love that. So I think one of the things that you really said is more than just like the tool, but it's like you brought the risk register to where people already are. You didn't just put it in a Word document somewhere or an Excel sheet somewhere that they have to click somewhere else. Like, you brought the information that is so critical to the place that they already are, and a tool that they're already comfortable with. So you're more likely to get feedback and mentions and things like that and have it be collaborative instead of just this artifact somewhere that just sits and doesn't actually get used.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So I love that.
Yeah, that point that you made earlier, that's useless. I mean, that's useless. Why are you doing it?
There's no way, Oh, it's a waste of time. Like, because someone told you had to like do a risk log one time and you just like check it off. Like,
right.
Okay.
The whole point is so you have something actionable.
Yes. All right, I knew we were aligned on that, Neil, but I was just curious, like when you said you did the RAID log, like if there were actually statuses that you used or something like that, but I love that. Okay, anyone else? It's gonna be hard to follow Neil. You're also welcome to use the chat if you would like. All right, quiet bunch.
So Molly, and great job, by the way. I hope that's not awkward. Great job. So maybe in your experience or the other PMs that are in your group, I think some of them might be on the call. So what have you seen as far as, like, maybe talk us through if you have examples of resistance within an organization when you're trying to get them to onboard with risk management?
Yes, not everyone likes to spend time on risk management. Some people think that just executing the tasks is the point, right? Mm-hmm. So again, there's a couple of different things, and I know you know this, Neil, but I appreciate the question, the softball, or as it were. So when we're talking about risk management, the first thing I do in project management, risk management, whatever, is to kind of get rid of the terminology in general. So like, I don't usually say risk register, and I'm not saying like I'm doing risk management for you, right? But risks, right? Like, what could go wrong? What are problems that might occur? Try to break it down to a level that's a little bit more accessible and makes everyone feel like they have input. right? So even asking for them for their specific experience. One of the things I work on with like a new client is like, okay, well, how did your last project go? What, and I don't necessarily say like, ooh, can I see your lessons learned register? Or ooh, can I see your risk register? Instead, it's just a conversation, right? So it's like, have you had good experiences with projects here? Like, what is your, like, again, trying to make them comfortable and sharing the information, because that's kind of the best way in my experience to do it versus like being super formal, and making them almost feel bad that they don't have a risk register or they don't have this concept already. So starting with where they're at. And like, again, I very seldom actually go into a client unless they have a pretty mature PMO and say like, oh, impact versus probability, like you need to go in and put this, right? Almost all cases, what we're doing is we're just like using that, like we're encouraging them to do the process as we go, and like we're using it as a tool that they can then adopt later. But we're trying to not overwhelm them or make them feel intimidated or feel like, oh my gosh, risk management is going to be an extra 20% overhead on this project.
Right.
No, it's actually part of project management. So really more understanding that like project management is not just checking off things on a task list, right? Your project team is not only going to just do like, I am completing this activity, but it is a collaborative team event that happens over the course of it. So really the big ones that I try to get through are risk management is not a one-time create a risk register, create a project plan, create a stakeholder register, check off the box and then move on, but rather it's an ongoing experience that you have, and spending that. And then oftentimes when war rooms are something that's kind of like a harder hurdle to kind of jump over, because it's like, hey, I want to go give these people an hour and a half to just spend time mitigating something that may not happen. That can sometimes be a little bit intimidating, especially if they're paying outside vendors or something like that. So usually don't lead with, oh, and by the way, we're going to go put these people in a room for an hour and a half because something might happen. It's more that we start off by the identification, like what problems have happened in the past, what are some solutions for that process. So it's like, I usually try to warm them up. That makes sense? Was that your question?
Yeah, I think, yeah, there multiple answers there. Thank you. Yep. I think, yeah, I just, sometimes change is hard, especially like, I don't know if the majority of the organizations that you've had the privilege to work with so far have been longstanding or newer businesses, but, my experience is, having moved through a couple different those types of organizations is, the longer they've been around and the more established, if they had a PMO coming in already, the harder it is to kind of, they have their systems and they just don't change, and it's hard.
I'm sorry, but in general, as a project manager, right? We're both project managers, PMI, all that other good stuff. Is like, I kind of feel like we come in and use our lingo and have our best practices and things like that. And I don't know that we're always great about meeting them where they're at, and or like we come across as intimidating. So like you come in and be like, oh, you don't have a risk register. You don't have any lessons learned for me to pull from. And again, I know that that's not your tone, but like if we come in from a point where they feel sensitive or insecure or judged. So I have like one of our team members and everything came from an organization that had a really bad experience with project managers and project management, PMO, and being really heavy. And that's an experience. That's a risk. People are going to be resistant to, oh my gosh, this PM made everything take twice as long. Do you have any idea how many meetings I had to do for this PM? Why couldn't I just write this down? Like those experiences are legit.
Right. Yeah.
And people's time is valuable. And that doesn't mean that project management isn't incredibly important and risk management isn't incredibly important, but it does mean that we need to adjust our approach for the communication and the experience of our project team so that we can get the best out of them and have the best results. And so that was a little bit preachy, but like, I just feel really strongly about everyone's a project manager, everyone's a risk manager. You do it in your day-to-day life. You don't need a whole bunch of really high-tech tools and high-tech processes and detailed automated processes to do really good risk management. It's okay to start from a point of immaturity and crawl and then walk and then run. Crawl, actually use your risk register for more than a checkbox that you did one. That's crawling, right? Actually do risk management throughout the whole project, not just firefighting and issue management. That is the first step. All right, with that, I am 1 minute until the end. I will get off my little preachy soapbox. I'm sorry about that, but like, everyone can do risk management. Everyone's a project manager. It is important. I'm hoping that you can take even just one tool or tactic away from our conversation today and apply it to your team. Again, Don't hesitate to reach out if you have a quick question. Love to meet new people, new organizations. We are on YouTube. Please subscribe and check out our other content if you enjoy the content today. Okay? Thanks, everyone.